Tomorrow night, as I referenced just a few minutes ago, is Tisha B'Av. Tisha is 9. It's the 9th day of the month of Av. It is the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. A number of tragic events happened to our people on Tisha B'Av: the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, the destruction of the second temple in 70 of the Common Era, the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans ended in defeat in the 2nd century. Jews were later expelled from England and Spain in 1492. Tisha B'Av is the day that we mourn collectively as a people. So I thought tonight to take a few moments to talk about mourning, but not collectively, that's tomorrow night, but more personally and individually, and talk with you about mourning, the mourning process in Judaism, and then conclude with a few things that I have learned about mourning, things I've come to appreciate. But let's start with something before the mourning process actually begins. Before Shiva. It's called aninut. When a loved one passes away, and your relationship is to that loved one of the following 7: mother, father, sister, brother, son, daughter, or spouse, the time between the death and the burial is called aninut, and you are an Onen. If we are an Onen, we are exempt from many of the positive commandments. For example, we're not required to pray. We're not required to put on tefillin. Why? Well, I think Judaism is sensitive in its understanding that grief can be all-consuming and emotionally devastating, and it's almost impossible for some people to put their heart into something like prayer. And the second is more practical. You're busy. You're busy dealing with the details of putting a loved one to rest for the final time. At the end of a funeral, after the interment, when you walk out, traditionally you'll find a mourner's line, if you will, on both sides, and people will greet the bereaved. And as they walk between them on their way out of the cemetery or to their cars, they emerge from an Onen, the person in between death and burial, to a mourner, to the Shiva period. By the way, it's interesting, I read recently that described as, in a sense, going through the birth canal, a rebirth. You are now reborn into a full-fledged mourner, and now Shiva begins. Shiva, or Shiva, is the word for 7 in Hebrew, and it reflects the traditional 7-day mourning period from the time of burial, not the time of death. I have to tell you, I think the whole mourning process in Judaism is brilliant because it gives us guidelines, it gives us a way to mourn and to find the mourning time particularly meaningful. For example, it's traditional to remain at home during the Shiva period. The community comes to you. You don't go to the community. We don't grieve alone. Your friends, your family, take care of you. Some of you may be familiar with the custom of the mourners sitting on low stools or covering their mirrors. It's a tradition not to wear leather shoes because that's considered a luxury. By the way, there's similarities here to Yom Kippur, which in many ways is thought of as a bit of a mini death, of course, with a good ending, right? We blow the shofar together, and we all expect you here, if you would like to be, to enjoy what I think is going to be a particularly beautiful Yom Kippur. One is to abstain from marital relations, and as I said, you don't go to work, and some people don't study Torah. What do you say when you see a mourner? When you go to a house of Shiva, by the way, it's considered one of the greatest mitzvahs in Judaism. So you go to a house of Shiva, you see a mourner, what do you talk about? Do you approach the mourner and speak about the person that they're grieving over? But maybe they're not in the mood for that. Maybe they are having a respite and want to think about something else. Or do you walk in and you're not comfortable speaking about the loss, so you talk about sports or something like that? In its brilliance, our tradition says, Don't say anything until you hear from them. Take your cue from them. If they want to speak about their loved ones, then speak about their loved one with them. And on the other hand, if they prefer not to for whatever reason, and they want to speak about something a little more mundane, then speak about something a little more mundane. And at the end of the 7 days, it's customary to take a walk around the block. And then you go back to work. Does that mean you're no longer mourning? Not necessarily, hardly at all for most. You may continue to mourn internally, but externally you begin to re-enter society. Some of you may know traditionally people will tear a garment at the cemetery if they're one of the 7 relationships, but many people today, it's more customary in our community to tear a ribbon, what's called the kriya ribbon. Kriya means torn, and you wear that ribbon on the right side for everybody, unless it's a parent, in which you wear it on the left over your heart. A lot of different explanations I've heard for that another time. But people often don't observe, and you wear that ribbon for 7 days. People don't always observe the full 7 days of Shiva. So what I suggest to people, and I'm sure it's not an original suggestion, but I don't know where else I would have heard it. I tell people, wear the Kriya ribbon when you're home. If you go back to work after 2 days and you don't formally sit Shiva, then when you get home from work, put it on. So you have a way of identifying your own mourning clothing, if you will, at that time. After the 7 days, for the next 23 days, a total of 30, you observe something called shloshim, the 30-day period. And for those 30 days, as I said, you return back to work, to your daily routine. But it's a tradition, for example, not to cut your hair, or for men not to shave. Not cutting hair comes from a pasuk, a teaching in Leviticus. Some people will restrict their social events. So, for example, they'll go to a bris or a wedding, but they won't stay for the party. Right? They are in a state of kind of semi-mourning. The Shloshim eases us back into the world. You may remember Sheryl Sandberg. She was the CEO of Facebook. Her husband, his name was David. I remembered it because it's my name, died at the age of 47, very unexpectedly. After and I don't know her level of observance. From what I've read, I don't think she was particularly observant, but she did observe the 30 days of Shiva. And this is what she wrote. I have lived 30 years in these 30 days. I am 30 years sadder. I feel like I am 30 years wiser. And after those 30 days, we fully return to society unless it's a parent who we've lost, and then there's some more restrictions for up to a year. My friends, loss, as we all know, is inevitable. Judaism gives us a road back. Judaism wants us to mourn, even if we are not in the mood for mourning. Judaism is far less interested in general in our moods and far more interested in what we do. So it gives us a methodology to do so. And by giving the mourner specific ways, it helps us to mourn. I'm so taken with the mourning process in Judaism. Early on in my studies, it was my rabbinic thesis, my senior year of rabbinic school, the evolution of the laws of death, funerals, and mourning. And I'm not a morbid person. It's precisely because of these that they give such a credibility to life. And finally, a few things that I have learned, mostly from you, from congregants. The first is that we all mourn differently at different times and in different ways. Some people mourn very quickly. Some people, it can take a long period. It's different for all of us. The second thing that I have learned is that mourning is not linear necessarily. That means you can feel more at peace for a few days, and then something happens and you feel the loss more acutely. It could be a song that reminds you of your loved one, or a holiday comes and they're not at the table, or maybe it's certain smells in the kitchen that you remember growing up. Something reminds us of a loved one and a wave of emotions returns. And finally, does time heal all wounds? I'm not sure. I don't think so, but I do think that time makes a difference. A congregant told me that he thinks of his father every day of his life. And there may be people in your lives that you think of that often. And as time goes on, we miss them, but I think we miss them differently. Sometimes we may miss them with a tear of sadness, and sometimes we may come to miss them with a smile. Gee, remember how much mom or dad loved chocolate ice cream? Gee, remember how he or she always dressed so nicely? And as the time goes on, there's a smile of joy and of appreciation. Tomorrow night we will gather for Tisha B'Av to commemorate the terrible losses for our community. And by the way, you're invited to join us at Dot Ariel. We're going to be meeting at a Dot Ariel in North Hollywood, but also we'll be with VBS and the three synagogues together. I believe it's those three. We will be conducting a service. And we're also going to be studying a Talmudic text, Baba Batra from the Talmud. The text is a discussion about mourning. I read it recently in preparation, and I learned that our sages, and remember, they were writing this soon after the destruction of the Second Temple. Our sages saw an increase in the number of ascetics, people who wouldn't drink wine or people who wouldn't eat meat, all because the altar was destroyed. In other words, they continued to be in this constant state of mourning. And Rabbi Yehoshua acknowledges in a brilliant back and forth discussion in the Talmud that they should indeed mourn. And yet, there should be limits to the mourning. Rabbi Yehoshua says not to mourn at all, that's impossible. The decree was issued, the temple was destroyed. But to mourn excessively, that is also, he says, impossible. I think what Rabbi Yehoshua is saying is never forget what happened to your community, and now begin to move ahead. And so too, I think it can be for us in our personal loss. Mourn them, love them, never forget them, and then with gratitude, let us move on with them at our side as we gather with them to embrace our future. Shabbat Shalom.